Hi, I'm Bill Holstein. For those of you who don't know Edie Lederer, she's been with the Associated Press for more than 5 decades. She's worked all over the world and covered basically everything, starting in earnest with the Vietnam War. We competed when we were both based in Hong Kong, and I worked for the late lamented United Press International. I won't review any of those gory details of that period of our time together, but we thought it would be fun and possibly quite valuable to have Edie take the lead in talking to our previous winners today as part of our program. They're obviously at much earlier stages of their careers than Edie and myself, but their experiences could help us improve our program and also be of use possibly to this year's winners who have been invited to view this. With us today are Dake Kang, who's done an incredible job for the AP in Beijing, Hong Kong, Wuhan, and Xinjiang, all the garden spots. He's zooming in from Beijing, so it's late evening there. Portia Crowe, who started off as a mild-mannered business journalist from Saskatchewan, has now become a hardcore correspondent in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. She's based in Paris, where she's calling in from. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, and BBC, among other outlets. And we have Jacob Kushner, who's done extremely well for himself from Nairobi, where Edie also worked at one point. Jacob's most recent coup was an article in National Geographic about the collision between people and hippopotamuses thanks to climate change. So this is a truly global event. Edie, I turn the conversation over to you. I'll be lurking over your shoulder, but have at it.
I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel with Bill. We both loved being foreign correspondents. And if you hear a touch of envy at what the three of you are doing in my voice, it's real. So why don't you each tell us briefly what drove you to be a foreign correspondent and how you got where you are today? Dake, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I am Korean American, born in New Jersey, but kind of raised all over the place. Spent a few years in Shanghai when I was growing up, and it just kind of sparked this interest in actually just the differences between different places, shuttling back and forth between Korea, China, and the US. And obviously part of the reason why I ended up coming back to China as well. When I was living in Shanghai, I picked up some Chinese. And I think, when I was going to college, I've always been very curious. I interned for CNN, and it was during the 2013 coup. And it was I just knew that was it. I really wanted to see history unfold right in front of me. But I knew that sitting in an office wasn't for me. So that's how I ended up in all these different places that Bill mentioned, Wuhan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang, and a lot of other places besides that.
Portia, what about you?
Sure. So I'm Canadian, so I've been abroad for a very long time, ever since going to school in the States. And I have always been, you go to journalism school and you meet a lot of people who love storytelling. They love the idea of stories or just the act of writing or producing film. But I've always been interested in the issues, I guess, and the content. And I went to journalism school wanting to be a foreign correspondent because I cared and enjoyed reading deeply about the world and wanted to participate in that. However, I did become a business journalist as well. And that I was a full-time sort of business correspondent for about 4 years. And I continue to do some business reporting, which actually really helps with my foreign correspondence as well. But I've been fully freelance for 2.5 years, based in Europe, but traveling around the world, as Bill mentioned, often in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and around Europe. Yeah, I'm very happy to be doing both, primarily that, but a bit of business journalism as well.
Jacob?
Yeah, I'm from Wisconsin, and through college was there. And yeah, by the time I graduated, I had worked for all the different newspapers there were to work for, and including editing the Spanish newspaper there. And yeah, when I graduated, I just decided to get out. And similar to what Dake said, I didn't want to just be at a desk. And so I moved down to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I had lived in the Dominican Republic and Haiti during study abroad. during college. And yeah, I just moved down there. It was right after Haiti's earthquake, and began reporting and investigating foreign aid to Haiti after that 2010 earthquake there. And I ended up getting some gigs with the Associated Press. A stringer there gave me a bit of a chance. And yeah, just ended up spending a couple of years in Haiti freelancing. And I transitioned to grad school because I wanted to move away from breaking news a little bit toward breaking and investigative toward long form magazine journalism and that sort of thing. So yeah, I went to Columbia and really learned a lot about writing and the process. And then thankfully OPC sent me to where I had been itching to go, over to East Africa. So I did my master's thesis on Chinese investment and engagement in Congo. So I wanted to go to Congo, but then the AP said, hey, you did a good job in Haiti, come with the OPC's help, come over to Nairobi. And yeah, things took off fast because my very first week there was the Westgate Mall terrorist attack, when the terrorist group Al-Shabaab stormed a shopping mall here. Anyways, a number of people were killed. And the police response to that was, frankly, in the aftermath, to crack down on Muslims and immigrants here in Nairobi. So from the get-go, I was reporting on violence against immigrants at the hands of the police and at the hands of other people, which led me to reporting on the violence against LGBT refugees in Africa, and eventually led me to Germany, where I spent a year investigating violence by Germans against immigrants in Germany, which has now just led to a book project that I'm starting. So yeah, just kind of mostly based here in Nairobi, reporting on everything from wildlife and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, just the ability to be abroad and be traveling around, with some exceptions during times of COVID, has been just so exciting. And freelancing has allowed me to focus on so many different types of stories, from wildlife to health, politics to migration. So yeah, I think that's what I like about it, is the ability to, pursue all sorts of different stories for all sorts of different publications.
So Jacob just mentioned what I was going to ask you all about next. You've spent the past year working, or trying to work, in a pandemic that shut down most of the world. How have you managed, and what obstacles have you faced? Let's start with Portia.
Sure. So I was one of the first sort of recipients of the OPC freelancer grant. So thank you very much for that. I think you've done a few rounds since then, but back last spring, I think it was sort of April, May, when that grant was first announced. And myself and a lot of freelancers I know were sort of struggling financially because we lost some anchor clients. A lot of publications sort of started reeling in any money that they had, nervous about losing advertisers and that sort of thing. So it was a scary moment, but then sort of with the help of a few organizations like that, got through the initial sort of concerns around the pandemic and potential loss of clients. But it's been busy. I mean, I know many journalists who have kind of recognize the pandemic for what it is, as a major story, and found ways to cover it. For me personally, it's complicated my sort of routine of traveling quite a bit, being based in Europe and traveling to other parts of the world. So that was sort of put on hold. And I started filing more dispatches from Europe amid the pandemic. So I'm actually kind of based between Zurich and Paris, so from both Switzerland and France. And it's one of these things where everything is about the pandemic. So even as I continue to do the occasional sort of business correspondence, it's about how our business is changing with people working from home, or how is real estate changing. And I mean, there's a million stories within the pandemic. So I guess it was sort of scary at first, but then thankfully like sort of an interesting chance to adapt and find new stories and new content.
I was part of that OPC grant giving, and the conditions we found on the ground were very tough. Basically, the whole ecosystem of freelancing is at stake, and so we've tried to give $750 and $1,000 micro grants out to help keep some people alive, and so. But it's still very much in doubt that that ecosystem can survive if this goes on much longer.
Jacob, what about you in the pandemic?
Yeah, I also was fortunate enough to be given an OPC microgrant, which was one of the first things that helped me do reporting during the pandemic. Even though there was a lockdown here in Kenya, I was able to travel to do this story on human-wildlife conflict that got picked up by Nat Geo. So that's a big thing. And Bill, on that note, Bill, I think it's great that a lot of organizations are also looking to support local journalists and local freelancers as well, because as hard as some of us have been hit by, I also lost actually about a 6-month project that I had just completed that just didn't get published and I wasn't paid for due to advertisers pullout at a publication. But imagine, these local journalists and fixers who rely on us even as freelancers sometimes. So I think a lot of people are struggling, and it's great that there are organizations out there helping. Some people, who do breaking news, I think maybe they focused on the pandemic. That was the big story. Everyone wanted to read about it. A colleague and I actually got together and pitched a project called Stopping the Next One, where we actually were planning on traveling to each continent to focus on a different zoonotic disease, a different animal-borne disease on each continent, and look at the risks there and the scientists who were studying that disease on the front lines, often local scientists from those countries, from those communities, to look at how important it is to fund research and the research necessary to find future pathogens and prevent the next pandemic. And so luckily, BBC picked up that series in a big way, and throughout the year we were able to do that. Although, again, we weren't able to travel like we'd planned, but it turned out great because we ended up working with local journalists as fixers in each of the continents, each of the places where we were doing those stories. And in many times, the scientists themselves were able to take photos in the field when they're vaccinating monkeys against disease or this or that. They, through training sort of by us, a lot of the scientists themselves were able to record footage and we did live interview tapes in the field. So yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge, but also really great working with scientists and sources themselves, as well as local journalists around the world, and learning how to collaborate, during these times when travel is difficult.
Dake?
Yeah, I think my life in the past year has been defined by the pandemic, as everyone else has. But I was probably the earliest to get there. I was actually in Wuhan, in that tiny window between when the government had declared that it was person-to-person transmissible and when they shut down the city. I'd actually left Wuhan something like 14 or 16 hours before the government had shut it down. It was quite shocking to me because actually the colleague that I had gone with, when I had gone to Wuhan, I was thinking it was actually pretty okay. There were still quite a few pedestrians out and about walking. People we interviewed said, oh, it's just wearing masks. Everyone's out eating and having a good time. It's just wearing masks. That's all. And I had a bit of a debate with my colleague who actually has a degree in biology, who is saying, oh, I'm really nervous about the situation. There's got to be some kind of cover up because there's so many people out and about right now. And I was saying, well, it seems fine. And she was like, Dake, what if they shut down the city tomorrow? I was like, what are you talking about? That'd be totally unprecedented, which, obviously she was completely right. And so the lesson is to listen to your wiser colleagues. I think after that, it was just a lot of reporting on the pandemic, and I really honed in on the government response to the coronavirus at the beginning, because I think that was kind of the big, gigantic question mark, was what exactly had the authorities known about the pandemic, and to what extent were they being transparent, and to what extent weren't they being transparent? And this was a question that I basically sought to answer with some of my colleagues over the course of the past year. Some very
Jake, how long were you in Wuhan for?
Consuming stories. I was there for 2 days, I think. It was not a very long. It was in that tiny little window between when we realized it was going to be a really big deal and when the government shut the city down.
Wow.
And so that was kind of the last opportunity.
It's like being in the scene of an atomic bomb going off in Japan or something. You were present at that moment. Holy shit.
Yeah. Well, I did not realize just how significant it was going to be, and it was really tough because obviously reporting conditions in China are not great, to put it mildly, and this was a very sensitive topic. But I think we were able to get more information about what happened than I had expected, which was gratifying. It was quite a year.
That's fascinating. Dake just mentioned something about working conditions. So You know, the conditions that are out there now are very different than the pre-computer and pre-cell phone era that I operated in Vietnam, which I must say did have its advantages. For one thing, no boss could call you in the middle of the night. And there wasn't the kind of micromanaging coverage and reporting that exists today. So Jacob, what's it like covering the backwaters of Africa and the Caribbean and some of the investigative stories you've done elsewhere in terms of conditions working?
Meaning governments and government harassment and things like that.
Yeah, Kenya certainly isn't the worst country in the world when it comes to government harassment of the press, but there are a lot of issues for local journalists, especially who report on politically sensitive topics. Since I'm reporting for international audiences, I'm not reporting on political parties that often and that sort of thing, but it's been rough here for some of my colleagues. I think one of the things that I was reporting on that was at least a risk here was since about 2013, I've been reporting on police brutality and extrajudicial killings by police, which of course this past year in the United States and around the world has been getting more attention finally. But back when I was, starting that reporting, there was, just this assumption that sort of here that police would kill suspects in the war on terror. But really what that turned out to mean is just police going around killing Muslims to make it look like they were doing something about the terrorist threat from Al-Shabaab after that Westgate Mall attack that I covered. So, I would meet the families of victims who were very afraid to speak because maybe the soldiers who had murdered their son in one case were just down the road within eyesight of where we were sitting in their homestead. And, the biggest challenge was protecting sources, really. Although, I don't think the danger to myself was anywhere near the danger to these families who had a loved one killed by police. I investigated all throughout the country kind of police killings of people, and we wanted to name names and name the police officers and up the line of command the people responsible for these killings. And I think what was interesting is that it wasn't really until this past year that when extrajudicial killings in the United States really came on to really got international and quite widespread national attention, that even extrajudicial killings in Kenya and other places in the world did as well.
Dake, I think we'd all like to hear from you about the new pressures that the Chinese government is bringing to bear on Western journalists, including you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, conditions have never been great in China. Obviously there's tight censorship, and as foreign journalists, we are able to write uncensored, but that does mean that there is extra scrutiny of our movement and our work and the people that we speak to, precisely because we are, a relatively free source of information. And that has definitely intensified recently. Back in last March, almost exactly a year ago, actually, I woke up to the news that probably half the American journalists in China had been expelled. Fortunately, I was not one of them, but I knew a lot of the people who had gotten expelled back then, and it was a clear sign to us all that we had to be careful. That did seem to be more about international geopolitics and this growing spat between the U.S. government and the Chinese government. But in general, on a day-to-day level, it is definitely getting tighter. When we go to certain places in China, we may get followed by undercover police or by government officials, and I do think that is becoming a more frequent occurrence. And sometimes that means that we will not be able to meet sources, or obviously we have to be mindful of what we tell our sources or what we ask them, because that could invite unwanted attention. There have been cases in which sources I've talked to have gotten in trouble, and they're speaking to me, right? So they know what they're getting. They're accepting interviews, and a lot of the people do know what the potential consequences are, but it's still very sobering to think that the people that we speak to can get in trouble. And sometimes do get in trouble. So a lot of the things that Jacob said about source protection very much apply. I would say that it's a bit different from other places in the sense that, I think if you're in the Middle East or Africa or Russia or Latin America, there's the danger can be quite physical. There's shootings or harassment by gangs or militias, or if it's a war zone, there's bullets flying around or artillery strike. There's none of that in China. China's it's a very safe place, but they're very, very sophisticated in terms of monitoring our communications, and that is really something that we have to be aware of.
Portia, you've also been covering Africa. What have conditions been like for you?
A story that comes to mind is not too long before the pandemic, I was in Uganda, and I did a number of stories, but one of them was about the LGBT community, which is kind of a fairly controversial issue in Uganda. 10 years ago, there was an attempt to introduce a law that would make gay sex punishable by death. And there was some talk about kind of, I guess, end of 2019 when I was there, not long before the pandemic, about bringing back a similar kind of law or some form of legislation. So kind of, I guess I just sort of would reiterate what Jacob said, which is that I didn't feel unsafe for myself. Worst case, maybe I get sort of hauled into questioning at the airport on my way out or something. But it was much more about the sources, protecting the sources. And other, any fixers or sort of, I didn't really use fixers, but sort of just chatting with local journalists and asking, or activists and asking, do you know anyone? Can I chat with? Oh, a friend of yours, can we get coffee? And it was really sort of just being careful about physical, sort of the ways that we were physically meeting. So like Jacob said also, can we meet in a cafe? Or are you not comfortable with being in public with a white person that, would maybe draw attention? But also the sort of the cyber, to Dake's point, the cyber security aspect of it as well. Making sure that, I'm using the right sort of apps on my phone and storing my data and my reporting in sort of the safest way possible, because I am also crossing airports. And so, can get sort of searched in that sense, because I'm not based there all the time. So yeah, definitely. That's a sort of a one-off case. Uganda is kind of a unique government. I can also speak to Europe. In France, I can definitely say that politically the situation is worse for journalists and getting tougher, over the last few years since the Gilets jaunes protests, but even just a couple months ago, the government tried to pass a law banning journalists or anybody from filming the police in any context in France. So, that doesn't sound like, the liberté, sort of freedom-loving country that France likes to pretend to be.
One of the things that's changed since Edie and I were in the game was that back then you knew where the front lines were in the world, but today the front lines are everywhere, aren't they? Being a woman correspondent might enhance your ability to get people to trust you, might make you a better correspondent, but on the other hand, it might also expose you to different risks and higher risks. So what is it like being a woman on the ground in Uganda and parts of Africa?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I certainly recommend anyone, man or woman or any gender, to take sort of a risk security course if you can, if you're going abroad. I took one about a year ago, January 2020, just before going to Niger for a project. And yeah, there's some gendered aspects to the, sort of your security risk plan when you're planning it. If anything, and I think I've said this before, I've had probably more frustrating experiences as a woman correspondent on Wall Street and in the city of London than I have sort of anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa.
That tells you something right there. So it looks like you all agree that the climate of government repression against journalists has worsened. What about visas, getting visas, more difficult, minders following you, which Dake has talked about?
It's pretty clear that we are on a tight leash. I am now only getting 3-month visas instead of the 1-year visas that we used to get. And that seems to be a direct result of political tensions between Beijing and Washington. But, in general, it seems like a lot of these restrictions are kind of meant only for journalists. I mean, a lot of the other restrictions on, other categories of visas, work visas, diplomatic visas, special mission visas have been largely lifted. And so people can kind of come in and out of China so long as they adhere to quarantine rules. And that's not the case for journalists. Specifically, we're the only category of people that has not been relaxed for. And a lot of people were stuck outside of China before the pandemic, and they haven't been able to get back in. And there's been a tiny handful of people who have been able to get back in, but most people haven't. And so that is really a source of frustration. I'm effectively stuck here, and I'm not complaining. I mean, China has controlled the coronavirus pandemic very effectively, and therefore I can travel around and kind of live life much more normally than friends in the US. And that is something I do appreciate. That being said, it is quite frustrating that we are getting these kinds of restrictions.
And you're in the middle of a sandstorm, according to today's New York Times.
Yeah, it was yellow. Yesterday, I woke up to a bright orange yellow, bright orange, I should say.
Wow.
But today it actually cleared up totally. So now it's totally clear. It was kind of astonishing to see how quickly the weather changed.
Jacob, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I recently had a few months ago when the civil war erupted in Ethiopia, I began trying very hard to get a journalist visa to go cover that. And it was quite a process. There were, you had to get the minister of 3 different ministries, like the minister in Addis Ababa to approve it. You had to get help from different embassies. I was getting help from the Nairobi embassy, Ethiopian embassy, the Ethiopian embassy in DC. And despite 2 months of trying, despite letters from my employers, Los Angeles Times, the Pulitzer Center, different places, ultimately the authorities delayed and eventually rejected my visa because it's frankly a very authoritarian government there that doesn't want journalists. In fact, they were at that time that I was trying to get in, they were kicking journalists out, the ones who had already been there, and harassing local journalists. Local journalists were even being arrested there in Ethiopia, even at the time that was trying to get access. And so I think that's something that as governments, certain governments, in East Africa, like Rwanda and Ethiopia, as they become very authoritarian, they have technology to be able to very well, monitor different journalists. People who did make it to Ethiopia had their WhatsApp messages and other messages intercepted somehow. And, someone would go for an interview outside of Addis where maybe they weren't supposed to be according to the government, and the government communications agency would know within minutes and call them and say, get back. So I think the technology is making it more difficult to those anti-democratic governments, such as we're seeing more and more in Ethiopia, that if they don't want you reporting on atrocities that are being committed and crimes and potentially even ethnic cleansing and genocide that could be going on right now in Ethiopia, they're going to find a way to keep you out. And that's something that's really frustrating, not so much as a journalist, but for the people who that war is affecting right now, when so little information is coming through those internet blackouts and whatnot that the government has imposed.
Yeah, I know that everybody's had trouble writing about what's going on in Tigray, and even the UN has had terrible time getting humanitarian people into some of the regions, and they still can't get people in. Going back to why you're all here today, how did the Overseas Press Club Foundation scholarship and work help you? Let's start with Dake.
Sure. I mean, it's pretty clear cut for me. I owe my career in Beijing to the OPC. I got the OPC fellowship in 2016, and I went to Bangkok with the AP with that OPC fellowship. And when I was in Bangkok, some of the editors there had liked my work, and they heard that I'd grown up partially in China, and I spoke some Chinese, although at that point it was extremely rusty. But nonetheless, they were, they really liked me and wanted to find a way to keep me in Asia. And I was actually going back to the US to work for the AP in Ohio in a different job. I actually interned for the AP in Philadelphia before I went to Bangkok. But I think they kept that in mind, and they figured out a way to get me to China when this job opened up. And I remember when I stopped in the Seoul bureau waiting for my visa, when I told people in the bureau that I had gotten a job in Beijing, people in the office were like, "What? The AP is hiring someone new?" This is a really funny reaction because, I mean, everyone knows how tough the journalism industry is these days. But it was, I mean, I was able to get myself here really thanks to the OPC fellowship. I mean, that was really instrumental to getting me in front of editors who could recognize that I could do some of this work and that were interested in bringing me here. And then on top of that, I think it's possible to be a freelance in other parts of the world. I mean, you guys are doing fantastic work in Africa and Europe. But in China, these days it's really almost impossible now to be a freelancer because of the restrictions. You can get in trouble for reporting if you're, outside the scope of your visa. And so it was really crucial for me to have a staff job at where I could get proper accreditation from the government with a visa and with a press card. And I mean, China's just been the most incredible story in the past 3 years. It's way beyond what I had imagined. It's been a very intense 3 years.
Right. Portia, what about you? What did the OPC Foundation scholarship do for you?
Sure. I almost feel like Jacob should go first because I think he went to Nairobi 1 year before I did.
Okay.
Maybe Jacob, you go first, and then
Yeah, we
I'll
had similar trajectories. Yeah, I think I mean, it sent me to the OPC fellowship, sent me to Nairobi 7 years ago, and I'm still here. So similar to what Dake said, I mean, it decided the trajectory of my career. I'm not trying to leave here anytime soon. But it's not just, the initial fellowship. I mean, the OPC, by inviting me back to the conferences and awards and that sort of thing, I've been able to meet editors and meet colleagues who, I've even pitched to or collaborated with on stories. The OPC has created, I think now, a sort of pitch database where they connect freelancers to editors who are their members. And then, of course, the micro grant, being able to go and travel during the pandemic to pursue new stories, which ended up working out quite well. So, I mean, and maybe even more so than anything else, the OPC will, if you keep them up to date on your work, they will definitely feature your work and your story ideas and what you're doing in their newsletters, in Q&As for the website, the bulletin, all sorts of things, which has been really helpful because, again, it's journalists, editors, foreign editors, and foreign correspondents who are reading that. So it's been really helpful as sort of a, kind of keeping tabs on what you're doing through your career. So anyways, it's been a huge help, and I definitely recommend that everybody stay as close in touch with the OPC in the years to come as you can, keeping them posted about what you're working on and going to them for networking questions when you need help, or especially if you're freelancing when you need to reach a certain editor as well.
Portia?
Yeah. So I won the scholarship in 2014 and went to Kenya. And met Jacob, who was very nice, as were other OPC alumni, and also we're both Columbia alumni. So I think, just met a massive network of really great journalists in Nairobi, which is just absolutely a great hub for journalists. And I did an internship with Reuters, which was, not something that with that bureau chief and in that bureau at the time would lead to a job in any capacity. And that's just almost like a stroke of luck where you end up if you get a placement. But it was, I was very tempted to stay in freelance. And I actually remember Jacob specifically offering to help me get set up freelancing out of Nairobi, and even offering me work, I think, because you had so much on the go. And I've just never forgotten how kind that was of you. I didn't at the time. I ended up going back to the US because I'm Canadian and I had this sort of one shot at a US work visa, which is not easy to come by, speaking of visas. And I would have lost it if I'd stayed too long overseas at the time. So I went back to the US. But I continued to, because I was in New York for like 4 years, I think, I continued to go to the OPC dinners. Usually this year we're virtual, but to network with the other alumni. And to me, that's been for sure the biggest takeaway. So meeting folks like Jacob overseas, but also just meeting the new class of alumni every year. I just think that is like it's just a sort of such a fantastic network that you can't necessarily find anywhere else. I've kept in touch with so many folks that won the scholarship after me. McKinney Bryce was somebody who won the same Reuters, I think, scholarship the year after me, and she went to Dakar in West Africa instead of Nairobi. Different bureau chief, different experience, and she works full-time with Reuters to this day. And so, it's great to see different people's trajectories, and certainly, yeah, keeping up with the newsletters and that sort of thing and seeing what people are up to. I can't recommend it enough. And yeah, I mean, you might look around and think, well, these are a bunch of nobodies. We're all sort of graduating or whatever. Like I don't know, maybe that's probably what I thought of myself at the time, but you'll be so surprised by how quickly people's careers take off and what a great, network it is, I would say.
Every year when the new crop of winners comes to New York, one of the key words I hear is community. Oh, there are more people like me. There are people like me who have these weird aspirations. Our family thought we were mentally unstable, and our friends thought we were sort of weirdo, but look at this. There are people here who care about covering the world.
Our three panelists, what advice they would give to this year's winners. Why don't we start with Jacob?
Wow. I mean, every year that I've been able to meet the fellows, they're an even more ambitious crew than the past year. So they probably don't need much advice other than to get out there and get going. But what I would say is one thing that's helped me a lot is when I landed in a place, whether it's Port-au-Prince, Haiti, or Nairobi, or Berlin, I just immediately reach out to other journalists there who I'm following. So, you find the news outlets in that place, you figure out who are the journalists doing the sort of thing you want to do or the ones you admire, and reach out to them. Ask them if you can get a coffee with them. Often I ask them, can I do work for free for you? Which sounds silly, but you want to pay it back a little bit too for the advice and help that people give you. And sure enough, if you help someone out, whether paid or unpaid, they'll start to throw work your way when they can't do it, or they might start to recommend you if you really show yourself. So definitely, as you're going abroad, I would recommend not just within your news agency, but also outside of it. Get in touch with other journalists who are doing cool things, and meet up with them. I very early on met a Kenyan journalist who was just doing incredible. He was actually a journalism student at the time, and he and I ended up now for 7 years have been doing collaborations almost every year, where we go on a reporting trip, whether it's about counterterrorism or World Bank evicting rural Kenyans from a forest where they lived. We go and do these investigations together. We co-byline them, we co-write them. He does a lot of the interviews with politicians here that I have a harder time getting, and I do more of the networking with foreign editors, and we team up. So whether foreign journalists or local journalists, reach out to people doing good work wherever you go, because it'll lead to opportunities. At least it did in my case.
Dake, any advice?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't stress too much when you feel like you're not getting anywhere. I think this is a pretty important point, because I think I remember struggling to try and get into journalism. It felt so daunting, just like a wall of rejections and mysteries about how people ended up in this industry, or how they got this story, or how they got this job, or what exactly is it do you do during your internship when you show up every day and your editor is so busy that they're not paying attention to you for the entire day and you don't know what to do with yourself. You're going to have a lot of imposter syndrome. You're going to freak out about not knowing what you're doing. You're going to freak out about not feeling like exactly how it is that you're going to make it in the industry, or how you're going to land your story. And that's totally okay. I, with the benefit of a bit of hindsight now, realize that I think that struggle actually is quite important. And so long as you just kind of keep yourself moving and productive in not necessarily ways that feel like they are bearing fruit externally, it eventually you'll get somewhere, right? I mean, just because you haven't, written a lot of stories, just because you've just started off, just because you've just graduated from college, you shouldn't feel like an imposter, because I think the mark of a good journalist is just someone who is curious, who's really keen on getting the story, who is willing to listen, who's willing to be aggressive. And those are just things that you can do yourself. It's not necessarily about, I mean, it is partially about the circumstances around you, but you can control your own circumstances, and you shouldn't feel like you don't belong. You do belong there. And the other thing is, at your internship, you might feel like, if you get a placement and you are interning somewhere, you might feel like you're not doing anything. And you might feel like your editor isn't giving you any work, and that might freak you out. And you should just, try and work on your own projects and your own stories, and look for story ideas, and, keep pitching story ideas. And even if it feels like it doesn't go anywhere, you need to kind of have the confidence that if you just keep at it, it'll go somewhere eventually, because it does. I mean, that was really my experience. And there was so much anxiety I felt in this whole process. So it is inevitable. Just don't, when you feel that anxiety, just realize that it's totally natural.
I liked what Jacob said about reaching out to other journalists. And that doesn't have to be just when you go abroad, that can be at any point. I would say I use Twitter. Like, it's just, if you're not on Twitter, you should be, unfortunately, because it's such a terrible place in so many ways. But I do so much networking through Twitter and meet so many journalists and editors, and it brings in a lot of work as well. Just I'm not out there pitching myself on Twitter, but I'm just getting to know people and following people that I think are smart and that sort of thing. So I would start doing that now and do it often. And the anxiety is real, yeah, to Dake's point as well, but you just sort of have to fight the imposter syndrome. And the other thing I would say is, if you're thinking of being a freelance journalist, just to think hard about having many streams of revenue, because the business model has just changed so much. And that's like, we could have a whole other panel about that. But just being really kind of realistic about your budget, and finding whether it's content writing or I do business journalism in addition to foreign correspondence, or something along those lines, start thinking early and often about your personal business plan.
It sounds like Jacob and Portia are both sold on freelancing. Am I right or am I wrong?
For now.
Yeah?
Yes, I am. I think I've applied to one job in about 10 years. I really enjoy freelancing because it allows me to write in different styles. Magazine, newspaper, it allows me to, one publication doesn't really love taking the story I want to tell in a big way. I can approach someone else. Of course, there's struggles, obviously, to freelancing, and financial ones, as Portia mentioned. But yeah, I'm not planning on, probably not planning on applying to any other jobs anytime soon. I really enjoy this. So.
Portia?
I would add, I'm very happy with it. It wasn't my sort of plan to be a freelancer for going on 3 years, but I've really enjoyed it. And I mean, I did choose to go freelance, but I just sort of thought I was taking a little break. But then in fact, work just started coming in, and it's been so fun. And to Jacob's point, I have friends that work in bureaus around the world, and they don't have the kind of freedom that we have, I think. I have friends with Reuters and other wires, and they want to work on a passion project and they can't. They want to work even on like a book proposal, and they're not really allowed to. They can't do a podcast if they want to. And they also can't get away from the desk a lot of the time. And I'm sure like that Dake can speak to this, and I'm sure it's not always this bad everywhere, but in a lot of cases, like you can't go do enterprise reporting because you have to watch the wires and that sort of thing. So don't be afraid of freelancing. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, like I have tons of sort of resources, networks that I can connect you with that really help, because there's a real community of freelancers out there, and there's lots of people that are going to help you get started if you want to.
That's great, Portia. Dake, if you could have your dream job, what would it be?
I mean, honestly, I think I'm pretty close to it right now, at least for the time being. As I mentioned before, I think in China it'd be pretty difficult to be a freelancer these days. So I think it's a great thing to do when you're elsewhere. Unfortunately, in China, things are a bit different. And right now, it's very real working for a wire. In the beginning, especially, I was doing lots and lots and lots of breaking news. Doing lots of videos of, shooting ping, shaking hands with The most memorable one was the King of Tonga, because nobody cared about that one except for Chinese state media and like the one Tongan journalist who flew in from Tonga. Not, not to diminish Tonga as a country, it's a great country, but there was a lot of that. There was just a lot of state visits, and there was a lot of just breaking coverage that I had to do, and it did consume a lot of time. But I've been able to focus on more of my own projects recently, and been able to take the time to do more in-depth stories. And I do think the AP is a great organization to work for, because they do welcome, different kinds of writing, and they do in-depth stories, enterprise stories. And so, it's worked. It's been great for me. And I would say that this is really, I wouldn't go anywhere else. China is really where I feel like I need to be right now, because it's such a huge story, and there's fewer journalists, foreign journalists here to tell it.
Incredible.
Bill,
Let's go to the
over to
question.
you.
Come on, Edie. So Kara Ledholm, your winner, the winner of the first Edith Lederer Awards, asked our panelists, what languages do you all speak, and when did you learn them?
I speak French and English fluently. I learned French growing up in Canada in school, and a tiny bit of Swahili that I learned in my undergrad degree, which was nice in Kenya.
That's great.
Well,
Dave,
Dake, we know you speak Chinese, and you speak Korean as well?
My Korean is not great. Funnily enough, my Chinese is better than my Korean, which I'm a bit of an oddball. But my Chinese was actually quite rusty when I got to Beijing in 2018, because it had been 6 years or 7 years since I'd last been in China, and none of my family speaks Chinese except for me. So it was a crash course. But now I can do interviews comfortably and all. So some Korean, maybe one day it'll come in handy somewhere.
Jacob?
Yeah, I learned Spanish in college and studying abroad in the Dominican Republic, then learned Haitian Creole when I moved down to Haiti. I'd learned some French before that, but it turns out when I got to Haiti, Creole was easier, so I just forgot French for a little bit and went with Creole. And then, when I went to Germany on a fellowship, I learned maybe conversational German. So yeah, Spanish, I speak Spanish and Creole. Okay, German, I'm going to brush up on that, and a bit of French. And I'm learning slowly Swahili on and off here. I should be better at it, given I've been here for so long, but yeah.
One of the consistent things we find is that these early exposures, a semester abroad or studying language in high school, or these kinds of experiences are important. They come at that when you're so young, but they have very powerful impact on people's careers. So we have a question also for Jacob. We're being asked, tell us more about how do you protect your sources from being intimidated by the police or being victimized? This is Arnaud asking this question. How can you protect sources from violence? How can you do that?
Yeah, that's, incredibly important. And it's not just police brutality, but to give an example, I was doing some reporting in rural Kenya on gun violence, gun battles between rural pastoralists fighting over territory and land and livestock. And in that conflict area, the police would just go enter a village, burn down the huts in the village, shoot people, and steal their cattle. So one of the armed groups were just the Kenyan police, who would go and get involved in these fights and steal as much as they could and kill people along the way sometimes. So we were investigating one of those raids by Kenyan police on a village in rural Kenya, and came across, just as we were driving, the skeleton of a man. And we found bullet casings nearby. A photographer and a Kenyan journalist and I teamed up and ended up kind of doing ballistic, with the help of an organization, sort of taking detailed photos of the scene and basically doing a pretty scientific analysis of what had happened. And we're able to determine that indeed such so-and-so police officers and such date had raided this village, burned it down, and killed this 80-something-year-old man. And we followed up by interviewing many people in that village. In this case, people insisted that we use their real names. They were so angry about this, of course. People who had lost loved ones. One woman, her kid got lost in the chaos of the fires around as the village burned, and she didn't know if her young child was alive or dead for a number of days. And people said they wanted to print their names, and in this case, unfortunately, I think the police and the authorities care so little there's so little repercussions or so little chance of repercussions for them, that it was safe in the sense that you could rename the police officers and they didn't care, because worst case, they just get transferred somewhere else and keep on doing what they do. So I think it's unfortunate with these, ruthless governments here sometimes. But then in other cases, when Portia mentioned reporting on LGBT individuals in Uganda, and I've reported a lot in those communities in Uganda, Kenya, and around the region. And that's another instance where actually sources might be, their initial reaction might be, yeah, print my name, print my photo. And the photographer and I, who spent about 5 years reporting on LGBT refugees around Africa, had to really talk through each and every source, at different stages in their reporting of, do you really, what could happen if your mom or your dad saw this, or that police officer who doesn't like you for this reason because you cross-dressed on the road. We would have these conversations trying to really, tell our sources, here are the potential repercussions that we envision. Are you sure you want, your name to be used? Because I think a lot of, I've had editors, less scrupulous editors that I had worked for in the past who, were just hell-bent on having, the names and photos of LGBT refugees and on video and on camera telling their stories. And, I had to stand up to that editor in that case and say, let's, if we get that and we think it's safe, that's great, but we need to really prioritize helping inform people who might not be familiar with the global media landscape and what could happen with their photo and how it could be go viral here or sent on WhatsApp. We need to really inform people, sources as well, so that they can then make a comfortable decision. And so, in terms of, I have used false names or pseudonyms rather before for characters. We've blocked out artistically in a way the faces of LGBT refugees before. There's all that sort of thing. But I think it's really up to us to inform people who might not know better about how, about what the dangerous repercussions of that, of their exposure could be.
We have a last question. One of the things that every year our winners ask is, if they get an assignment to a bureau, is how do they get along with the bureau chief? How do they engage with the bureau? And one of our winners this year is Jimin Kang. Dake has a very interesting story, born in Korea, spent time in Hong Kong and in Brazil. So she has a placement with Reuters in Sao Paulo because she speaks Portuguese, but it's going to be a virtual placement, a virtual internship or fellowship. What any suggestions in the view of the pandemic imposed requirements? How would you say to engage with the bureau if you can't be there in person?
Yeah, I mean, what I have to say, it worked out much better than I thought with this project for the BBC called Stopping the Next One, where, I mean, this was a bureau in London, although they have an office here, it was the London BBC office that, was basically allowed us to, work in a unique way by using scientists who were like going into the Brazil rainforest, studying monkeys and using, using their footage and their photos and being more lenient with that, with their permission, of course. So in terms of the reporting, I mean, I think it really is possible to do so much virtually these days and get really quality. You find the Brazilian scientist who's an amateur photographer and loves taking photos, and send him over a tripod so he can do some video too and make it happen. But in terms of pitching editors and making those connections from afar, I think that's again, a personal introduction to an editor is going to go so much farther than cold pitches. So if you're freelancing or if you're applying jobs, I think try and reach out to other journalists who are writing for those publications and ask, like, hey, would you be willing to share your editor on this? I liked your story for the Atlantic or whatever it is. Do you think you'd be able to pass my story pitch along? And so anyways, I think so much of the pitching as well can be virtual, and the reporting, there's creative ways to do it, especially by collaborating with journalists, local journalists around the world. And there's great platforms for finding journalists, from Ghostwriter to there's any number of different platforms for finding people to collaborate with.
Well, thank you. We have to end it there. Thank you, Jacob, Portia, and Dake, and your forum postings, and Edie, thank you, coming from Manhattan, I assume. So
coming from UN headquarters. And if I just wanted to say one thing about languages, because I think it's an interesting question. There are 6 official languages at the United Nations: English, French, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Arabic. And I once got asked if I had my life to live over what would I do? And I said I would try and learn as many of them as possible before I went to university.
So thank you all, and you're leaving your legacy, your impact on the next generation behind you, coming up behind you. So that's a great feeling. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank
luck
you.
to all the.
Thank you.
Good luck, everyone.
Congratulations.
Terrific
Bye,
panel. And
congrats.
congratulations to all the new winners.